The silence broke not with the thunder of guns, but with a whisper, a single, fatal radio transmission sent across the Pacific airwaves. It was April 7th, 1945. That message sealed the fate of 3,000 souls and condemned the greatest warship ever conceived, Yamato. She was 70,000 tons of cold, impervious steel, a floating monument to imperial ambition, the world's largest battleship. Now, she was nothing more than a sacrificial offering. High Command knew the brutal truth. She was sailing straight into an abyss. Yet they sent her, as Yamato steamed northward, 300 American aircraft, a relentless, hungry swarm of metal, were already turning toward their target. The inevitable collision was minutes away. The transmission had sealed their doom, marking the beginning of the impossible mission. To understand this act of terminal desperation, we must rewind the clock just 24 hours. It is April 6, 1945. Deep within the suffocating silence of naval headquarters in Tokyo, a secret meeting was underway. The atmosphere was thick with the dust of defeat. Admiral Somu Toyota sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his face drawn in gray, etched by sleepless nights and the crushing weight of a collapsing empire. The maps spread before them were a tapestry of disaster. Hundreds of American ships ringed Okinawa, forming an impenetrable, merciless steel wall. Japan was suffocating. The officers studied the inevitable truth. Every avenue was blocked. Every option was gone. Then a voice, strained and low, finally articulated a question that hung like smoke over the room, the question they had all desperately avoided. What about the Yamato? The Yamato. She was more than just steel and ordnance. She was a divine embodiment of Japanese naval power. It was the largest warship ever conceived, a monstrous steel leviathan, 72,000 tons of defiance, armor like a fortress, and armed with 9 main guns capable of hurling shells the size of small cars, shells that could annihilate a building with a single seismic impact. She was the unparalleled pride of Imperial Japan, the magnificent battleship Yamato, the symbol of absolute naval power. Now, she was their final, desperate sacrifice. Admiral Toyota stood over the tactical maps, the sharp creases in the paper mirroring the fatal clarity of the situation. Every man in that room, every officer heading to sea, knew the brutal truth. The Yamato sailed unsupported, stripped bare, no protective air cover, no escort fleet, and almost no fuel remaining in her bunkers. And facing her lonely charge were more than 300 American carrier aircraft, a sky choked with inevitable, concentrated vengeance. This would not be a battle of maneuver or strategy. This was an assignment for oblivion. The chilling, undeniable core of this mission lay in its logistics. The High Command had issued a staggering directive. The Yamato would provision with precisely enough bunker oil for a one-way trip to Okinawa. Let the brutal implications settle. One path forward. No fuel, no plan, no expectation of return. The sailors knew it. The officers knew it. Command had written it into the death warrant. This final, hopeless charge into the heart of the enemy fleet was consecrated under name Operation Tango. The coordinates flashed on the map board. They called this forward sector the Anchor, a beautiful name for a suicide mission. The plan delivered to Lieutenant Carl Hartmann was simple, stripped of military jargon. Sail the remaining tanks straight into the heart of the German counterattack. Use the Shermans as mobile shields, drawing fire and slowing momentum of Operation Luttich. Blow up as many panzers as possible, then use the wrecks as immobile obstacles. If the engine failed, if the track broke, the crew, Lieutenant Hartmann, Gunner Earl Bishop, Loader James Ortega, and driver Tony Vitelli, would climb out and use the main guns as fixed anti-tank artillery against the inexorable push toward Avranches. It sounded desperate, because it was. The Allied lines were fracturing. The successful breakout that had promised victory was now threatened by a massive, last-gasp armored thrust. Their cities weren't burning yet, but the supply convoys were crippled. Their air cover was stretched thin. The tanks of Lieutenant Hartmann's company were all that remained to hold the crucial choke point of Mortain. But even that was unlikely to be enough. Back in the command bunker, Major George Marks finally spoke. His words were calm, cold, delivered with the chilling finality of a court-martial sentence. He looked directly at Lieutenant Hartmann. ignoring the stunned silence of the assembled officers. The fate of the entire European theater rests on the successful defense of Mortain against Operation Luttich. But here is what Major Marks didn't say out loud. The grim calculus everyone in that room, from Lieutenant Hartman down to Private Tony Vitelli, already understood. This wasn't just a desperate stand anymore. This was a death grip in the churn mud of Mortain. The fate of the entire Allied thrust depending on whether a handful of exhausted crews could bleed out the mechanized hammer blow of Operation Luttich. Inside the searing hull of their Sherman, Lieutenant Carl Hartman pressed his scarred cheek against the comms gear. His gaze, though fixed to the optics, seemed to look right through the steel plate. He tasted the fine metallic dust of pulverized stone and high explosive. The turret shrieked under the relentless strain. Target, 11 o'clock, 50 yards. He requested, shouted Gunner Earl Bishop, his eye socket bruising against the scope pad with every jolting shift. Before the command was fully issued, Loader James Ortega slammed a massive round home, his hands a blur of brass and cordite, the heat from the breech searing his palms. The resulting explosion outside was deafening, the report instantaneous. The smell of spent propellant thickened, mixing with the sharp ozone of the radio static. The tank shuddered violently as driver Tony Vitelli instinctively corrected the track slippage caused by the heavy recoil and the slick earth. Hartman needed every detail logged precisely for the necessary AR. Refusing the order to hold this vital junction meant not just a summary court-martial. It meant the catastrophic collapse of the entire front and the immediate surrender of Avranches to the oncoming Panzer spearhead. The dawn broke not with light, but with a deafening roar of armored fury. Communication lines, previously humming with tactical details, went dead, replaced by panicked, fragmented signals warning of panzers surging west. The alert flew up the chain of command, confirming the unthinkable. The German High Command had thrown everything they had into a desperate, monstrous gamble. They called it Operation Luttich. Inside the rattling M4 Sherman known as Fury, Lieutenant Carl Hartman gripped the commander's handles, his jaw set against the vibration. This was no localized counterattack. This was a concentrated effort to split the Allied armies, aiming straight for the coast and the pivotal crossing point Avranches. If they failed here at Mortain, the entire invasion could collapse. "They're coming fast, Lieutenant!" yelled Tony Vitelli, the driver, fighting the stiff controls as he navigated the treacherous high ground. The tank's interior was already choked with the acrid scent of oil and anticipation. Tensions were high, but the crew worked with the lethal precision of men who had faced death too many times to panic now. "Earl, prepare AP." Hartman commanded. Earl Bishop, the gunner, smoothly adjusted his sight picture, his breath coming in steady, controlled bursts. "Locked and ready, Lieutenant. Just give me something to shoot." Behind him, James Ortega, the loader, slammed the next round into breech with a vicious metallic click. His muscles corded under his sweat-soaked fatigues. Ortega didn't speak much. He just fed the gun, the living extension of the M4's firepower. The entire crew knew the stakes. The German thrust was fueled by fanaticism and a single-minded objective. They had been told this was a glorious mission, a final, desperate stand for the Reich. Many of the enemy soldiers driving those tanks weren't stupid. They knew what their one-way fuel allowances really meant. They were coming to kill or be killed. The early morning air was shockingly clear, offering a perfect, deadly visibility that gave no quarter to hiding machines. Silent, tense, the American crew stared into the horizon, waiting for the first sight of the inevitable. The skies above the Pacific were impossibly clear, a crystalline, perfect blue. Perfect flying weather for the hunters. The super battleship Yamato, the final, desperate hope of Imperial Japan, was an island of steel sailing into the void. Slow, massive, utterly exposed. Then the horizon was pierced. Tiny specks grew swiftly into an unstoppable cloud of American vengeance. The attack began precisely at 12:30 p.m. The first wave struck like a tidal bore, 50 Hellcats and Avengers screaming down from the sun. The air turned liquid with the weight of ordnance. Bombs fell like iron rain. Torpedoes, sleek and deadly, raced through the churning water, seeking the battleship's heart. The Yamato roared defiance. Her colossal anti-aircraft batteries erupted. filling the atmosphere with white-hot shrapnel and black smoke, tearing apart a handful of aircraft. But for every plane she downed, two more followed. The assault was merciless, wave after wave, swelling to a crushing total of over 300 aircraft. The Leviathan twisted and fought, her tremendous bulk attempting impossible maneuvers to evade destruction. But she was too vast, too sluggish, too tragically alone. The final, fatal blows began to land. Torpedoes, 1, 2, 5, then 10 and more, slammed into her starboard side, tearing gushing holes below the waterline. Explosions ripped through the armored skin of the hull, buckling massive steel plates. Below deck, pandemonium reigned. Men screamed, steam hissed, and tons of freezing seawater poured into the lower compartments, crushing the structure. Yet, amidst the rising chaos, Admiral Ito stood on the bridge, the embodiment of doomed resolve. Calm, the final, agonizing seconds stretched. At 14:05 hours, the captain knew the inevitable had arrived. The order, delivered with voice scraped raw by smoke and defeat, crackled across the loudspeakers. All hands abandoned ship. But the spirit of the Imperial Navy was not easily broken. Dozens of crewmen defied the order, gripping the sweating metal of their turrets, attempting to spit defiance until the very moment the sea swallowed them. The great ship Yamato was bleeding out. Then came the terrifying, conclusive moment. At 14:23 on April 7, 1945, the battleship began its inexorable roll to port. Water poured into the breached hull, and the giant warship emitted a sound that curdled the blood, a metallic shriek, the death rattle of a wounded behemoth. Men scrambled into the churning ocean, while below decks, hundreds were trapped in a steel coffin. The tilt increased rapidly, 30 degrees and 40, and then the unimaginable. The main forward and stern magazines detonated simultaneously. Thousands of rounds, countless tons of propellant. The accumulated fury of the Yamato ignited in a single catastrophic instant. The resulting blast was not just an explosion. It was an oceanic eruption. A column of fire and smoke, 6,000 meters high, pierced the clouds, dwarfing the battle raging below. American pilots, miles away, reported being slammed by the brutal shockwave. The light of the Yamato's final breath was so tremendous, so blindingly powerful, that it was observed from the coast of mainland Japan, more than 200 kilometers distant. The greatest weapon ever crafted, 1,000 feet of steel born of imperial arrogance, was still churning toward its final target. Then, in the hellish haze of battle, the battleship simply vanished. The void where the Yamato had sailed was instantaneously filled by rolling smoke and foaming wreckage. 3,000 souls were swallowed by the churning Pacific. A city of men, reduced to flotsam. Only 276 managed to claw their way back to the surface and survive the abyss. Admiral Ito, the architect of the final sacrifice, took the ultimate plunge with his flagship. Back in the obsidian halls of Tokyo High Command, the wireless crackled with devastating finality. The official AR after-action report was an exercise in brutal, sterile terminology. Operation Tenno concluded, Battleship Yamato lost, objective not achieved, but the real truth, the horrific calculus of their desperation, was whispered behind polished mahogany doors. We knew what they said privately revealed everything. The official dispatch was a lie. One senior officer, his voice barely a rasp in the quiet room, admitted the unthinkable. We sent her to die. We knew she would die, and she did. There was no shock, no grief, only cold, desperate acceptance. Another general, staring into the distance, summed up the true, bloody objective. The Yamato's mission was never to win. It was a message etched in blood. Proof we still possessed the will to fight. This was not strategy. This was an act of national self-immolation. August 1944. The German High Command, desperate and cornered, gambled everything on a final, suicidal counterthrust. Operation Luttich. The objective was audacious. Spear through the Allied lines and seize the vital crossing point at Avranches. If they succeeded, the entire American advance in Normandy would collapse. It was a fight for inches, measured in mud and shell casings, particularly in the shattered farming country surrounding Mortain. There, isolated and outnumbered, was the crew of the Iron Saint. At the turret viewport, Lieutenant Carl Hartmann watched the oncoming shadow of the Panzers. The noise was deafening, a physical blow that rattled the nerves. Inside the steel hull, Tony Vitelli, the driver, kept the engine running hot, ready for the inevitable retreat or advance. The true terror was absorbed by James Ortega, the loader, whose arms ached from ramming round after round into breach, his hands slick with sweat and cordite. "Halt! Fire!" Lieutenant Hartmann commanded, his voice raw. Earl Bishop, the gunner, adjusted his sight, compensating for the tank's violent rocking, seeking that one perfect kill shot against the enemy heavy armor. The entire fate of their sector depended on the coordination of these 4 men. They fought not for medals, but for survival, knowing that their company, including the decimated platoon led by Captain George Marks, was counting on them to hold the hinge of the entire Allied front. They held, but the legacy of that brutal August week would haunt Lieutenant Hartmann long after the war's end. The immense loss of life necessitated a meticulous accounting. He spent weeks agonizing over every sentence of his official AR, detailing the moment-by-moment decisions made under fire. Had he pushed too hard? Had the sacrifice been worth it? The shadow of doubt was long. Years later, when political infighting sought scapegoats, the threat of a court-martial was whispered, simply because victory at Mortain had been so costly. Yet the brutal, unyielding defense mounted against Operation Luttich, the defense that saved Avranches, cemented its place as the definitive turning point of the Normandy campaign. The wreckage lies still, scorched and hollowed, near the crossroads outside Mortain. But the story of what happened there still echoes, a brutal reminder of the true cost of war, the crushing weight of impossible orders, and the price of true honor. High Command knew Lieutenant Carl Hartmann and his crew, Gunner Earl Bishop, loader James Ortega, and driver Tony Vitelli, were doomed when they sent them forward to stall the armored spearhead of Operation Luttich, the desperate German push toward Avranches. They sent them anyway, and when the smoke cleared when the objective was secured, the generals barely blinked, because sometimes history isn't written by the heroes who face the fire. It's written in the cold, bureaucratic ink of the men who gave the orders. They filed the formal AR, noting the necessary sacrifice. A few days later, the whisper started about potential court-martial proceedings for those who showed insufficient tactical aggression. George Marks's name is often whispered here. The great counterattack, Operation Luttich, had been shattered. Yet, the cost to Lieutenant Carl Hartmann's company, the sheer, cold acceptance of human sacrifice, revealed the true, terrifying nature of military command in World War II.